Astle on ABC Radio.
Tales of a City by the Sea was a play that was written by my next guest, one of my next guests, a play that was so successful it toured the country, it toured Malaysia, it was put on the VCE drama list, and the playwright herself earmarked as a stellar talent, one who could put the human into human stories, stories of division, separation, crisis, particularly in that area of displaced people. She's back. She's back with a new work. It's called Them, that looks at 5 young people having to make the biggest decision of their lives. It's about to open in Melbourne, but if it's anything like the previous work, it's bound to get beyond the borders of Victoria, just as those 5 young people argue, discuss and torment over whether they will break their own borders to survive. Because after all, as one of the characters says, in the middle of a war, you're still also in the middle of living. So how do you reconcile that? In a war-torn city that has no name, but right now it's 3 people in the studio. It's a host, David Astle. It's the creator of this new play called Them, and it's the director of this same play, Them. And I think, let us turn to them. Samah Sabawi, writer, and Bagryana Popov, director, and ask about the origins of Them. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
These 5, Samah, I understand, in fact, the origins of the play took place in the most unlikely of countries, Finland. How did all that take place?
I was in Finland on a working tour, and I happened to be there in 2015 around the same time that the refugee crisis broke out, and we saw footage of refugees walking on foot, leaving Syria and into Europe. And I happened to also be there at the same time as the Finnish National Day, and that was a day when nationalists took to the streets and decided to protest immigration. There were some Nazi protests carrying crosses with fire and so on. So I was advised by my handlers in Finland to not leave my hotel room on that day because it may not be safe. So I stayed in the hotel room, and I started thinking, what is life like for people before they're made refugees? We only tend to see them after they've become refugees, after they've lost the normalcy of their everyday life. But what would compel people to make a decision like this, to leave everything they know and to risk their lives and to carry their babies? And from that, I started writing. So
I'm picturing you in a hotel room as all this clamour and burning crosses are happening in the street, and you just trying to draft a play. Was it what did you do actually on that day, as though that kind of furore was seething around the city?
I literally got up, had a coffee, sat on my computer, and started typing.
So it really was the day that the play began.
Yes, I wrote an entire first script on that day. The first draft was all written on that day. I finished at like 9:30 at night.
Does that strike you as being a little bit extraordinary, Bagryana?
Extraordinary, phenomenal. I don't think I've actually heard that in the 2 years of preparation and conversations that it happened on the one day. But Samah is just so extraordinary in her clarity of thinking and her capacity to capture an image, a scene, a dialogue, and people's stories, and they were probably all cooking and there inside her to ready to come out.
And needed that National Day to be a catalyst. Now, Bagryana, you have, as a director and as a dramaturg, you've been working, and as an actor, of course, you've also been working largely in that sphere of displacement and refugee experience. Why have you gravitated towards that particular focus of performance?
Well, that's really interesting. It's a good question. I have done a very broad range of work, but it's true that it's been a consistent theme. And sometimes I initiate the projects and sometimes they come to me. So it's interesting that's what happens. I think it's because I was a migrant myself. I didn't come to Australia as a refugee. I came as a migrant, but there's just something that happens to you when you're displaced, whether with legal status or not.
Where did you migrate from?
Bulgaria.
Bulgaria.
So I was born in Bulgaria, in Sofia, during the time of at the time it was behind the Iron Curtain in the Eastern Bloc. And so I was just, look, migration as a child can be it's an enormous rupture. And so it leaves you with a whole lot of questions and stories and experiences and a need to make sense of things. And a lot of theatre has been made in the last 15, 20 years, actually across the ages, but a lot of theatre tells this story of what the question of home, what is belonging, what happens to one's identity when you have to bridge a huge change like that, and when you come to a new place. And Australia is full of these stories, so these stories just keep coming.
Of course they do. And Samah, you also have this story within you. Your own heritage is rich, and your own itinerary to be in the studio is quite dizzying. Can you give us a kind of rough, mud map of the journey you've made to reach this studio tonight?
Well, I was born in Gaza, in Palestine, and my family was made refugees in the aftermath of the 1967 war. Took my first steps in a refugee camp in Jordan. From there, we went to Saudi Arabia. We lived there long enough to appreciate the rest of the world. And we, from Saudi Arabia, we came to Australia, and then I met my husband, and we lived in Canada. And so I'm Canadian, Australian, Palestinian.
Is there a word for that?
I joke now because post 9/11 reality, what it means now is I get to be othered in two of the best nations on this planet. So I'm very lucky to have that experience, I guess.
And in Saudi Arabia, I also understand that you discovered black comedy.
Yes.
Tell us about that discovery.
How did you know that? Look, in Saudi Arabia, we didn't have spaces to play. We were there in the 70s and in a city called Dammam. And at the time, Dammam was just rising from the sand. There wasn't much there. And so my sister, who has incredible imagination, and she can whip up stories in seconds, she would gather...
Finish stories in Igor.
Well, my dad is a storyteller and an author himself as well. So she would gather all the children, and as soon as the sun would cool off, she would take us to the rooftop, and we would put on plays that she would write for us. And so that was how I discovered plays, but also because in the Arab world, a lot of the countries have draconian and dictatorship rulers, and so theater in the Arab world was very subversive in its way of trying to educate and raise awareness and make political points without getting the actors in trouble. So black comedy.
It's 18 past the hour. You're with David Astle on ABC Evenings. My guest tonight is Samah Sabawi, who's the playwright of a new work called Them. It's about to open next week in Melbourne, and Bagryana Popov, the director of that work. It seems as though you two are kind of a match made in heaven. Both your focus on the sort of the marginalised and those seeking identity and a sense of belonging, and it's very much the focus of your work. It's particularly your two sort of most prominent plays, Samah. So how did you meet? What was the kind of the moment that you two got together? I'll ask you, Bagryana.
I believe I stalked Bagryana.
Oh, you stalked her. That's how it worked. Bagryana, is that how you remember it?
I got a call or an email, and I read the script, and I just thought it was a beautiful script. It was beautiful and honest and strong, and in particular, I just loved that on the front page it said the author encourages culturally diverse casting. And that was really important to me because it was telling a story from a really particular part of the world, but really what it's telling, the story that it's telling, is about people's lives when they're in a moment of crisis that's outside of their control, and the human need to have a home and to be safe. And so it was a beautiful, honest, strong piece of work. So I said, I have to meet this writer, and we met, and I just thought Samah was
It's a pity you didn't get on with it, but you still loved her work. Samah, I mean, I've been reading the reviews, particularly for your first work. Obviously, Them is still to come. But Tales of a City by the Sea, and two words that struck me. One was human, how you bring the human to the story. You remove the abstracts, you remove the kind of rhetoric, and look at and you kind of find the human in these big stories. And the other word that I thought I'd love to explore and get your thoughts on is that you are a very generous writer. Your plays are full of generosity. What do you think that means?
With the generosity, I guess it means that I allow each character to have all the dimensions that it requires to be real. My characters are not perfect. They're not lofty. They're not one-dimensional. They make mistakes. They say terrible things. They act like the rest of us. And on the other description, human, I think when you've traveled as many places as I have, and you carry and juggle so many identities, you come to the realization that we are all the same. And it's bringing out this sameness in a play about a people that are demonized in a society that I think in doing that, I'm saying, look, they're just like you. You know, they may have funny sounding names, different color skin, they live in a different part of the world, but this husband, all he wants right now is to get it on with his wife, you know, and that's the opening scene in our play. They love in the same way. They react to things in the same way, and we're all the same. And if we can just see that, then I believe that a lot of the world's problems will be solved.
So you wrote that first draft in Finland back in 2015. How many drafts and how many notes from Bagryana did it take to reach the final draft?
Many drafts. I had a wonderful 2-week development with Bagryana that was really, really helpful. And we made a lot of changes and a lot of notes back and forth. She advocated for some lines that I took out to be put back in.
So tell me about those. I'm just as curious in the big decisions as the small. What were some of the salient decisions that you put to Samah?
I haven't made any really strong or radical requests or cuts or changes. I think it's been more about detail, but there was. Am I allowed to say my favourite line?
Sure, say it.
I think you have to now.
There was a line that Samah had taken out, and I said, no, this is just too beautiful and too strong. And it's the line, death doesn't wash away shame. The only thing that washes away shame is survival. And it's a woman speaking, and it's a woman speaking who's been through terrible things. And so the play really has a very strong voice of women's experience as well as men's experience. So I think I just at times said, yes, this really is a key moment, please don't change that, or yes, this very funny line, we've got to have that, or sometimes if it was detail really.
One of the beauties of La Mama, and also the fact that your previous play is still on the drama list of VCE, is getting those sorts of open workshops with drama students and with young people and with general audience as people kind of discuss the play afterwards. What are some of the responses that you've had to your work in general, Samah, that you've found sort of most intriguing or provocative?
Look, the responses have been lots of really good responses. I think with Tales of a City by the Sea, the highest moment for me was this year when I had a school call me from Palestine, from Jerusalem, who were doing the play, and they wanted me to see what they were doing via Skype and to talk to them and to take questions. And it was a fantastic experience. I was talking to these young girls who, have are learning the play in their school. And then one girl got up and said, "It would be really nice if next time you write a play that doesn't have dirty words in it." And I was laughing. I was like, okay, I will try my best. Of course, this play does have dirty words in it. So.
Well, I advocated for the presence of some of those words because the characters.
I'm like, let's clean it up, Bagryana. She's like, no, we're not cleaning it up.
No, because one of the things I feel compelled to say is that, and this is really unexpected, is that there's a lot of humour in the work. So we just had a showing for a student and staff audience at La Trobe University, where I teach, and the students loved it, and there was a lot of laughter. And so when we say what the subject matter is, people expect it to be heavy or strident, and actually the work has a lot of lightness. And the humanness is a lot of humour. There are these beautiful scenes of three young men mucking around and doing what young men do when they're in each other's company, sort of being a little bit, disrespectful and loving and saying some really un-PC things. But the humour is what keeps it very alive and close to the ground, as well as the not-so-clean words.
Yeah. Look, I've learned from my family in Gaza, going through all the wars that they've gone through, that really it's humor that carries them through, and their ability to make jokes at the worst times possible. Just before the moment that you break, you stop yourself from breaking and shattering by cracking a joke.
Earlier this week, we had a physician who worked in emergency, and he's in a kind of very different setting, but in a way paralleling what you just said. When things are at their most acute and drastic, humour is a survival tool. I mean, is it distinctive amongst Palestinian culture, this idea of humour being a really kind of important survival tool?
I think this is one of those things that we talked about before, about we're all the same. I think we're all the same. I think we're all the same. There's humor that comes out. I was just worried that my Arab humor wasn't going to translate well, but judging from all the laughter today, I'm glad it's come across well.
It works. And so, I mean, you have not you've deliberately not given it name, given it a kind of particular context. Was there a thinking behind that, and what was your sort of strategy behind that?
Look, I want people to watch this play and be able to apply the story to any refugee that they see. This is not about Syria or Iraq or Yemen. This is about all these places where families are under the bombs and having to make decisions that are so difficult and impossible to make. And so I think the minute you name the place, it becomes about the politics of it. And, I'm so fed up with the politics of everything. I think we get lost in politics. We forget that the political decisions that are made, they impact human beings.
I love the title of the play, because I think the success of it will be You Will See Them As Us. And that is the challenge of the play, I presume. And you're 6 days out from showtime, from opening curtain. I'm going to ask you, Bagryana, how's it all shaping up? I know it might be bad juju to talk about, but, is everyone hitting their mark?
Well, look, we have a beautiful team, 5 wonderful actors, and fantastic designer and sound designer, and we just had this run today with an audience, so we've trialled it in its very delicate, early walking days, and look, I think it's a very strong work full of a lot of heart, and I can't wait to share it with an audience.
And I hope that audience becomes larger and wider as the success of it at La Mama sees it cross to the likes of WA and other states. The name of the play, is Them. It is opening at La Mama in Melbourne on next Wednesday, May 29. Only runs for about 10 days, so you need to be quick, anyone in Melbourne. I'd certainly try and get along, and let us hope that that Them becomes us, and that translates around the country. So lovely to have you both in.
Thank you
you
so
very
much.
much.
Thank you.
La Mama is the place to head, lamama.com.au. Samah Sabawi, the writer, and Bagryana Popov have been my guests.